Hey everybody, I'm Joshua Palmatier, and besides writing epic fantasy for DAW Books, I am the founder of Zombies Need Brains, a small press that basically produces science fiction and fantasy themed anthologies. And we do all of our anthologies through Kickstarters, and we have a Kickstarter running right now. So if you head on over to Kickstarter and search Zombies Need Brains, our Kickstarter should pop up. We're trying to raise 30,000 in order to produce four different themed anthologies. And I'm here today with Sam Butler, otherwise known as SC Butler, and because he's an editor for the anthology called Dragonesque. I am also one of the editors for Dragonesque. And we want to talk to you a little bit about Dragonesque, what it's all about, and also, since we're both editors for it, what we might be looking for in the slush pile. But first, let me introduce Sam. He's a past editor for Zombies Need Brains from multiple anthologies. The most recent one is called A Brave New Worlds, which just came out this month. So you can get that anywhere you like to buy books, hopefully. Ebook, trade paperback. If you want the Kickstarter edition, you have to go to the Zombies Need Brains online store. But otherwise, you can get the trade and the ebook pretty much everywhere. Okay. He's also edited the anthology is called Submerged, about basically science fiction fantasy stories underwater. Then Gills and Glaives, which is a sword and sorcery anthology. We did Apocalyptic, which got a lot of submissions, obviously about apocalypses. We did When Worlds Collide, which actually has a story or two that's up for the Small Press Awards. So fingers crossed for that. And he edited with Patricia Bray another anthology called Portals. And one of the stories from Portals was also up for the Small Press Awards. So some good anthologies produced by Sam here, but he does other things as well. So Sam, introduce yourself and what else you do besides editing for zombies.
I don't really do much else these days. I'm still sitting on this book that I wanted to self-publish that I had all ready to go about a year ago because I've been very not a year ago, 8 months ago. I've been very lazy about the title. I mean the cover art. I have the cover art exactly in mind, but I can't do it, and I've been too lazy to look up and too cheap to look up anybody else to do it for me. Um, but so like Josh, I should say I'm actually a former um, epic fantasy writer. I did have a trilogy come out called The Stoneways that came out from Tor Books, which you now can get from me, both in original hardback form and as newly formatted ebooks with new stories in each of the three volumes. Um, and I have a vampire book that I've self-published called The Risen, which I've always thought of as having a great idea for vampires. So I've always thought that vampires, people want their nasty vampires, but they also want their boyfriend vampires too. And I myself much prefer the nasty vampires to boyfriend vampires, but I thought in order to try and reach that market, it might be a good idea to try to combine the two. So if you ever want to look at a story where you can see vampires that can both be what I call saints and complete monsters, though not at the same time, try the Risen, which you can get at my through my website at mutablebooks.com. I'm also on Facebook under SC Butler, and but mostly these days I have most of my fun working on these wonderful anthologies, and I'm looking really forward to breaking the apocalyptic submission record with Dragonesque, because who doesn't want to write a story about dragons, right?
Exactly. I have to admit, I'm also a little terrified about what the submission number is going to be for Dragonesque. I mean, I kind of knew Apocalyptic would probably be up there. It went beyond my expectations at the time, and so a little bit of horror setting in for for the upcoming Dragonesque open call. which we can't do unless we get funded. So people go over to the Kickstarter and help us reach our goal. As we record this, we just crossed the 17K mark. So we got a ways to go to hit the 30K. So keep that in mind. Let's talk a little bit about Dragonesque. Why don't you tell everybody what you consider the theme of Dragonesque to be? Because we're going to be very particular about this one aspect.
Right. The theme is about dragons, but that doesn't mean you can just send in any kind of story about dragons. It's a very particular theme, as Josh says. We want all the stories to be from dragon's perspective, from the dragon's POV. If you've got a story that you want to write about a brave knight coming to rescue the princess, even though that's a big cliche, we don't have a huge problem with it, as long as you write the story from the dragon's perspective. We don't care about the hero's perspective. We don't care about the princess's perspective, except as you get that out through the dragon's perspective, because the dragon's perspective is what we want. We want the story to be written from the dragon's perspective. And that really is the primary point. Often when people ask us about, what's the thing we need to most look for when we're making a submission to Zombies Needs Brains, the key thing to do, you'll be amazed. Make sure you know exactly what our guidelines for what stories we're looking for are. You'd be amazed at how many stories we get that don't follow those guidelines. Sometimes it's obvious that they didn't follow. They've got a story that they think they wrote for something else that they think might fit, but often it's a very small. It misses just in a very small way. And the best example of that, I would say, is in Brave New Worlds, which just came out. We had 3 stories that we loved. We loved those 3 stories, but they didn't quite work within the guidelines. They weren't exactly Brave New World stories. A couple of them were When Worlds Collide stories. So you've got to be very, very careful of what we're asking for. And what we're asking specifically for here is 2 things. A story about dragons that's told from the dragon's perspective. Do you have anything you want to add?
No, but I would say that the stories that we didn't take for Brave New Worlds probably were When Worlds Collide stories. They probably wrote the stories for that, but they like missed the deadline for that call or something, and so they threw it into the Brave New Worlds one. So yeah, read the guidelines. I mean, we're going to post guidelines as soon as the Kickstarter funds. And the guidelines usually say things like, this is the kind of thing we're looking for, and this is the kind of thing we're not looking for. And I would guesstimate that, a good 40% of the people that submit things haven't even read the guidelines. So, don't just say, oh, it's a dragon anthology, and then throw the story at us that has the dragon mentioned on page 5. That's not the point. If you really want to have a chance of getting into this anthology or any anthology, take that extra 5 minutes to go read the guidelines, just to see, because often the editors do say things like I know Neil Clark from Clark's World, specifically has on his website, do not send me any zombie stories, no matter what kind of zombie story it is. He doesn't want to see any zombie stories. And I would wager he probably still sees zombie stories every single month because the people haven't read the guidelines. So when the Kickstarter funds and those guidelines pop up, take a moment to read those guidelines. We probably have something important to say in those guidelines. One of the things that zombies, or what I like to do with zombies anthologies, is I like them to have a lot of variety. So we know this is going to be the dragon's point of view, that kind of story. So anything you want to say about the variety that we're looking for our anthology?
Yeah, variety is very, it's very helpful. Another thing we might do if we get too many good fantasy stories for an anthology, because we do like to have some fantasy stories, some horror, some humor, some SF. Believe me, if you can write a good SF dragon story from the dragon's point of view for this book. Um, and I can't even think of any examples of that off the top of my head. You know, maybe it's a mechanical dragon. I don't know. But
Just Anne
a
McCaffrey.
robot dragon. Who knows?
Well,
But if you can get
Anne
it,
McCaffrey.
I'm sorry. Yeah, like, yeah.
Yeah, Anne
If you,
McCaffrey's.
uh, or you know, actually, that's an idea. If you can write a story about a dragon as imagined by Anne McCaffrey becoming self-aware, that's probably something we're going to take an extra look at. Though we may have some difficulties with copyright issues, but we will still take a good hard look at it. But obviously, so my point is, if you can come up with a good science fiction idea, the submissions are probably going to be light on science fiction ideas for Dragonesque. The theme lends itself to fantasy and will probably be predominantly fantasy in what we publish, and what we select. But that doesn't mean we aren't looking for other stuff as well. And I always put in a strong blurb for humor. Humor is very hard to do. That doesn't mean you shouldn't try. And we are always looking. We never have enough, I think, good humorous submissions for the anthologies. So if you can write a good humor, go and try to write a good humorous story. Take your shot at it, because it's likely to be. We might even read it even more carefully than we would otherwise, just because we're always looking for more humorous stories.
Yes, we like the full spectrum, light to dark, humorous to serious, all of that. Definitely look for variety. And yeah, I would agree that we're probably not going to get a ton of science fiction dragon stories. But yeah, we're going to be looking for them. Certainly want them in the anthology. But again, it's got to be good. We're not going to take a science fiction dragon story just because it's science fiction dragon. It's still got to be well written. So you and I together, who even knows how many submissions we've read at this point. But anything in particular that you want to warn people about or suggest based on our experience of reading the slush? Like, is there any type of story that we seem to get a lot that I mean, you're reading along fine and you finally just say, okay, this is not going to work because of such and such. Anything along those lines that you want to comment on?
I wouldn't say if there's anything along the stories themselves, but I would say formatting is important. I can't think of any off the top of my head, but if you Google short story formats, acceptable short story formats, you'll find many sources on the web. And I must confess that if you send me something where the typeface is difficult to read, if if it's white letters on a black background, if it's purple script, that is going to be like 5 strikes. That's going to be 2.5 strikes out of 3 against it right there. It is really very important for people who are reading a lot of stories, and we anticipate to be reading a lot of stories for this anthology, that you make the process as easy and as pleasant as possible for us. A striking font will not. Some people think a striking font will help. A striking font will not help you. It will be a huge hit against your story. The story will have to be beyond the pale of wonderfulness to really get past the first 2 pages.
Yeah. Yep. I would agree with that. I mean, the guidelines usually specifically say we want, basically standard manuscript format. And we suggest fonts and all that kind of stuff. But every year, and I usually say, docx file or doc file or, RTF file, but every year we get PDFs. And I'm like, no. And in general, we're not the type of press that dumps it automatically just because it's a PDF and didn't follow the guidelines. But like Sam said, it's a strike against you. Basically, I've already in my head said no, and you're going to have to do something spectacular to get me back to yes when you do that. So read the guidelines. I think I would add to that. What we really want is we want a complete, fleshed out character setting, plot, everything story. We If you can do that in 1,000 words, then great. But more than likely, if you submit something that's Flash, it's not going to have all of those elements completely fleshed out like we would like. So in my experience, just reading the slush pile, generally the Flash pieces aren't complete stories, they're just ideas.
What do you think? Have we ever published anything shorter than 2,000 words?
We have like one or two. We have in the Where anthology, we published one that was like 1,500 words. I think it was the Starfish one in the Where anthology. That one was very, very short, but we published it because it was a complete story. It was, the fact that it was short didn't matter for that story. We had the full character development, we had the full world set up and everything, and it was a complete story. But in general, yeah, the shorter stories have a tendency not to really be what I consider anyway,
right,
fully fleshed out story. And I would say they're just reading the slush that a good chunk, maybe 30%, I don't even know, a good chunk of the stories that I read, by the time I get to the end of the story, my comment is that this was just an idea. And even if it's 6,000 words, I get to the end and I'm like, okay, this was just an idea. There was no point to the idea. It didn't like affect a character or change the world, or we're looking for, like I said, that fully fleshed out idea. It can't just have one of the three elements. And the elements I consider our world, plot, and character. So it can't have just one or two of those. We really want something that has all three. So think about that before you submit that story. In particular, I think this applies to the Dragonesque because, like you said, most of this is going to be fantasy settings. And for a fantasy setting, I got to know a little bit more about the world because it's not our world. And it's going to take you probably a little bit more to develop that world believably, a little more words to develop that world believably for me. So yeah, think about that before you end up submitting. I really want. Sorry about that.
I turned mine off.
I thought I turned mine off, but apparently not. Okay. I'll have to call it that. But
I was also going to add, conversely, we often get submissions. They're quite plainly the first chapter of a novel.
Yeah.
And those actually can be, I find them the most irritating almost of anything we get, because often I'll be halfway through the story and say, this is interesting. There's some stuff here. And then, 2 pages later, I realize, it's another one of those. It's another first chapter of a novel. And unless the first chapter of a novel is a self-contained story, it's not going to work.
Yeah.
No chapter of the novel is going to work unless it is a self-contained story within the greater body of the novel. And I wouldn't, if you got a self-contained story in a novel that you think works, that's great. Send it in. But if I can recognize it as a part of as part of something larger that isn't complete, then that's not going to work for us.
Yeah, and when I'm reading and I get halfway through, usually halfway through any story, I sit back and I say, can they believably tie up everything in the last half? And you can almost always tell when it's a chapter from a book or something like that. You can almost always tell halfway through. And it's just like, oh, there's no way. They're not going to be able to take everything they've introduced and tie it all up nicely in a short story. And invariably, that's what happens. If I get that feeling halfway through, by the end, that's what's happened. So yeah. Anything else that you can think of?
Yeah, one other thing, a little push for ZNB, and the reason to fund the ZNB Kickstarters is that we're a little different from a lot of the presses, small or big. We actually don't have any slush readers. The editors read everything. And I know, speaking for the editors I've worked with, I think all of us tend to look at everything. We may skim, but we do tend to and it was Josh was the one who taught me this. We tend to look at the beginning. If we don't like the beginning, we might skim and go into overdrive, but we look at the end too, because you never can tell that somebody might have a really fantastic idea at the end of a story that makes you think, well, maybe I'd like to see this reworked.
Yeah.
And so we do look at everything, and I want to emphasize that we look at everything, and that's really Josh's philosophy. And we like to see what you do, because we have been really wonderfully surprised many times, and that's one of the things that I think has us coming back and doing this again and again.
Yeah, I mean, I can't even count the number of times where I'm reading and I'm like, within the first couple pages, I'm like, this is not good enough. But then halfway through, all of a sudden, something happens, something clicks, and it's just like, oh, here's a really good idea. Here's a really good story. All we got to do is cut off the first half.
and sometimes have the writer rewrite it 5 times.
Yes, we've done that before as well, where we think the idea is really, really good and it just needs some work. And yeah, we will take the time and effort to put in multiple revision passes if necessary, if we really like the idea. So keep that in mind. And Sam's right. We don't have any slush readers. It's the editors are the ones reading it and making all of the final decisions. So we end up seeing everything. It doesn't go through a couple other people first before it gets to us. And anything else you can think of for Dragonesque? I think this is a pretty straightforward theme. There's not a whole lot you can do to make it tricky.
I mean, I suppose we will probably accept a wide definition of what a dragon is. I think if you write a story from a Komodo dragon's perspective, if it's a good story, we will certainly consider it. So keep that in mind. We will look at, especially if you prove your point in the context of the story, we will look at wide variations of what a dragon is. But it's got to be a dragon.
Yeah,
it can't be a turtle.
And I would say that I meant to mention this earlier, but the whole story doesn't have to be from the dragon's point of view completely. You can go outside of the dragon's point of view, but you can't go outside very much. The majority of the story needs to be the dragon's point of view. So yeah, don't fixate on absolutely everything must be dragon's point of view. But yes, a significant portion of the story should be from the dragon's point of view. Because I can imagine there are some stories where you need to go outside of it every now and then for a scene or two. But yeah, other than that, I think it's pretty straightforward. So if this has intrigued you at all or sparked your imagination and you're interested in the Kickstarter or submitting to the open call, if we actually get funded, then head on over to the Kickstarter. Like I said, you can go to Kickstarter and just search Zombies Need Brains. It should pop up. But if you want to go there directly, the short URL is tinyurl.com/ZNB Kickstarter 2022. Okay, so again, that's tinyurl.com/ZNB Kickstarter 2022. And that should take you right to the Kickstarter. Like I said, we're just over 17,000 on the Kickstarter. We're trying to get to 30,000. We do still have a couple weeks left though, so hopefully we'll be able to make that 30K. And as soon as the Kickstarter gets completely funded, we'll start the open call. Yeah. So if we get funded this weekend, open call starts this weekend. I doubt that's going to happen, but I would be surprised unless somebody has, 13,000 just sitting around that they want to donate.
Right.
But check out the Kickstarter. Check out our past Kickstarters already out there. And I want to thank Sam for being here today.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, hopefully we'll be funded and be working hard on the many, many submissions I think we'll get for this. Thank you all for being here. See you at the Kickstarter.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
See you later, Sam.
Bye-bye.